We're going to go ahead. Welcome to our final Common Agenda Briefing Book educational event. Just right off the top, I want to say thank you to everybody at VCN. Thank you to all the participants. I'm recognizing a lot of your names that have attended, honestly, probably each and every one. And thank you to all of our authors that are here, obviously. The rest are here, but thank you to everyone who had a hand in putting this together and had a hand in working in this. It's been a great experience. But with that said, just in case you are not sure why I'm thanking everybody or not sure why you're here, this is VCN's final Common Agenda Briefing Book educational event. So what that basically means is this is our Common Agenda's kind of coming out party. It has chapters based around issue topics such as transportation or water or police prevention, or like today's event, equitable inclusive government. And within that, there are about 40 issue papers that were crafted by 150 plus network partners. And so, like I said, today's issue area is equitable inclusive government. But without further ado, without me talking anymore, I'm going to pass it off to Pat.
Hey, folks, Pat Calvert here, Virginia Conservation Network. I'm your Senior Policy and Campaigns Manager for all kinds of stuff, but mostly water, land conservation, and critters. Thank you all to our co-authors, and also thanks to Kyle, who set all this up. This is the first time we've done this, so he was working from a very clean slate, and well done. I've received nothing but positive feedback from folks. Enough about me. I want to introduce this chapter. It's Equitable and Inclusive Government. It's fairly broad in scope, but it gets to some issues that have really come out in the past couple of years, several years, with citizen participation and with COVID and people not being able to be in the same place and same time, people going outside a lot more than they normally had, our schools being closed, all kinds of things. To start it off with, we're going to hear from Connor Kish from Sierra Club Virginia chapter on ensuring robust citizen representation through our citizen boards. Then from Patrick Fanning of CBF, Bay Foundation, on modernizing Virginia's public access to government decision-making and ensuring robust public participation. Caitlin Schmidt with the Center for Progressive Reform on improving environmental enforcement and transparency for a cleaner, healthier Virginia. Tanisha Griffin with the New Virginia Majority, prioritizing environmental justice in state government. And Helen Kuhns from Lynn Haven River Now, thank you for joining, Educating for Equitable Environmental Literacy, a great new paper that I'm really happy to see that we're engaging on this topic at VCN. So if you have questions, you'll see at the bottom of your screen a little chat box. Sorry, right next to it, you'll see a Q&A. Put all your questions in there if you like. Or just hang on to it. Well, actually, you'll put them in there, and then after all presenters have presented, we'll save some time at the end for Q&A after the last paper. So without further ado, I'm going to shut my mouth and pass it right over to Connor on ensuring robust citizen representation through Virginia's citizen boards.
Thank you so much, Pat, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking a moment of your day to hear us out on the papers that are contained in this section. Glad to be kicking it off with a paper that is titled Ensuring Robust Citizen Representation Through Virginia's Citizen Boards. And I want to thank my co-authors, Patrick, who you will hear from in a moment, and our other good friend and fellow champion, Dave Sly at Wild Virginia, who also contributed a lot to this paper through the process. This is an interesting paper in several regards, and I think the overall theme of why it is the most interesting sort of broader scope paper is that this is a very important process of state government, where really important decisions are made in a venue where many citizens either don't understand how it works or don't even know that it is working or don't even know that it exists. Citizens sometimes think that the most important decisions of government are made in backroom halls of the governor's office or in backroom halls of the legislature. But these are really important decisions that are made out front in open in public meetings by citizens. And the stakes sometimes could not be higher. And the purpose of this paper is to do several things. The first of which is to reaffirm the absolutely critical importance of the citizen boards themselves. The citizen boards, which are comprised of Virginia citizens appointed by the governor in staggered terms, oftentimes make decisions regarding air pollution, water pollution, waste pollution, and like I said, are making these decisions in public. But because of that, there are a series of challenges that have come up, and some of them are COVID related, particularly how citizens have access to hear and speak to the members of the board. But there are also more deep structural concerns with how the boards are set up, laid out, and processing the information that they receive. The challenge that the authors of this paper have determined revolving around citizen boards are mostly dealing with information, how the members of the citizen boards receive information, who they are receiving information from, what are they allowed to do with that information is the third and probably most important component. One of the things that we recommend in this paper is that not only the citizen boards continue, but that the citizen boards be able to receive information outside of the agency staff recommendations. The citizen boards are not, in our view, designed to be an extension of the opinion or results of agency analysis or agency employees, but are rather to be a representative of all voices, most importantly, the citizen voices. And currently, the board structure is such that the members of the board very rarely receive information that is not reaffirming directly from the agency opinion or the agency opinion being delivered to them directly by the agency. We think that the current board framework should remain in place and that the board members should be allowed to seek alternative legal advice and information beyond agency employee staff, because we think that there are a lot of organizations, such as the ones that are represented on this call and the ones in attendance, that can provide information to the board members that the DEQ either doesn't have the resources to provide or is choosing not to provide. The citizen boards also have an inherent structural issue in providing access to the people of Virginia to actually appear in front of those boards. There are onerous requirements currently in place that state that a citizen of Virginia cannot speak to the board at a public meeting unless they had previously been participating in the comment process that could have been going on for months and months before the citizen even became aware. And yet when it comes time for the board to make these critical air, water, and land decisions, the citizens are not able to appear in front of the board because they didn't demonstrate interest early enough in the process. And that's simply ridiculous. That is one of our most important recommendations in this paper, that the citizens be allowed to come to the board when the decisions are being made because the board represents them, the citizens. And one of the final things that we want to recommend that the boards consider doing is to break down the board's membership by subcommittee, because there are members of the board that have come to their position on the board with different backgrounds, different expertise, and different interests. And sometimes the citizens of Virginia can really benefit from that, particularly when it comes to environmental justice concerns, because oftentimes there is no opportunity for environmental justice communities to provide their voice to the citizen boards, and they oftentimes are providing critical information that's often missing from the entire narrative that had been built up to that point. We think it's important that the members of the board be allowed to form subcommittees that hear and receive information from communities beyond those organizations and individuals that have elected to participate in the process from the get-go. We believe this is an inherent barrier to the successful operation of the citizen boards. In closing, I just want to mention that the point that we're trying to emphasize here, which is that the citizen boards are important. They are a venue for government action to take place in public and avoid private backroom deals on very important topics that affect Virginians. But there are some inherent structural concerns that have to be addressed because there is always the opportunity to improve a process and make it better for Virginia. And this paper sets out some really important, although somewhat unknown, opportunities to do that. So thank you for listening. I will be putting my email address in the chat, and I'm happy to take questions at the end as well as via email in the days ahead. Pat, back to you.
Thanks. And I'm going to hand it promptly to Patrick Fanny of Chesapeake Bay Foundation.
Thanks, Pat. Let me see if I can get my screen sharing going here. Let me know if you're seeing that.
Yes.
Good. Okay. Thanks. Hey, everyone. I'm Patrick Fanning. I'm our Virginia staff attorney at Chesapeake Bay Foundation. I want to give a quick shout out to Robin Broder and Morgan Johnson. Morgan, formerly of Waterkeepers Chesapeake, Robin still with Waterkeepers Chesapeake, but they both help with this paper, as well as Ann Achilles with the James River Association. So thanks to them. You know, the COVID-19 pandemic has taught me to look at silver linings over the past 2 years. And I think one of the few silver linings that we've seen from the pandemic has been increased access to public access to government decision-making as a result of the orders from Governor Northam during the state of emergency. So the General Assembly provided streaming opportunities of its committee and subcommittee meetings. They also provided an opportunity for virtual testimony, while imperfect, was still an improvement. Also, agency proceedings and citizen board meetings were really brought into the 21st century with greater access through virtual participation. The hard work of our regulatory advisory panels and technical advisory committees continued in a virtual setting. So how do we build on these silver linings and these increases in public participation to increase access to government decision-making? So here are the opportunities. There we go. Here are the opportunities. How do we modernize public communication tools for the legislature, agencies, and our public boards? How do we use public input advances to increase public participation? How do we make public participation more accessible to more people? So for instance, one of the silver linings was that the historic practice of solely in-person meetings really limited the ability of parents or people who are differently abled or low income or aging, or frankly, who just live too far to drive all the way to Richmond to give 2 minutes of public testimony at a meeting. You know, this really changed the dynamic of how people are able to participate and inform their citizen boards and be heard. And there are certainly still existing hurdles that Connor mentioned that we're hoping to overcome as well, but providing greater access is a great place to start. So here's the opportunity. Here are some of the solutions that we've been advocating for in this paper. Really getting the General Assembly to continue live streaming all their floor proceedings, which they have done, but also their committee and subcommittee meetings, increasing the opportunity for testimony before those committees and subcommittees, even in a virtual format. Subcommittees and committees were also taking testimony in advance of the meetings, and we thought that was a really helpful change that we should have the General Assembly continue. Next, allowing the agency stakeholder meetings to be held virtually or through a hybrid in-person and virtual meeting process. I mentioned the governor's emergency order related to the pandemic. And one of the key aspects of that order was that it allowed these RAP meetings and TAC meetings and other sort of meetings to be conducted virtually, whereas under the existing FOIA law, which governs quorums and requirements for these kinds of groups, public bodies, there had to be an in-person quorum. There could be some remote participants, but there had to be an in-person quorum. And so that requirement in state law really tied the hands of public bodies after the emergency order was lifted from continuing to do any work virtually without an in-person quorum. So we're calling on changes to the FOIA law to address that issue so that there can be both in-person and virtual participation. Again, a lot of people have access challenges if you are only having these RAP meetings in person in downtown Richmond. So we're calling on some changes to the FOIA law to address that. And then how do we improve the public notice process so that it's actually reaching people and not through just the historic kind of publish it in a newspaper, and so long as you get the newspaper, you'll know about it. We really need to bring the public notice process into the 21st century as well, and find ways to meet people where they are. And also to remove procedural barriers to public testimony before citizen boards. So with those solutions in mind, here are the recommendations that we put forward in our paper: extending and codifying remote participation options for both the legislative and the agency processes, providing wider notice of agency actions. Again, here through media forums, actually getting in with community groups who can help disseminate the message throughout communities, and then removing restrictions on submittal of new information at board meetings. There's a lot of overlap between Connor's paper, which I also worked on, and this paper, in terms of how we increase public access. And I didn't put a slide on this, but I kind of wanted to briefly touch on, what have we been doing since we drafted this paper and made these recommendations. All of the citizen boards, as well as DEQ's public participation guidelines, were recently put out for periodic review. So we've submitted comments on those, drawing on some of the AIR Board's Public Engagement Subcommittee recommendations. We also are engaging with the FOIA Council on some draft language that they're considering that would address concerns, like I mentioned, regarding the in-person quorum requirements. So I'll wrap up just by saying that we're facing a new political reality right now, but I'm hopeful that this is one area where everyone seemed to enjoy the increased public access during the pandemic, bringing us into the 21st century. And I hope this is something we can find consensus on with legislators and beyond. So turn it back to Pat. Thanks.
Thank you, Patrick. And many of our partners that are, I'm sure, on here today have been able over the past few General Assembly sessions to really actively engage with our General Assembly and subcommittee and committee meetings at 7 a.m. If you're out in the Shenandoah Valley, you need to testify on a bill. That's a kind of a haul for 3 minutes of floor time. So I thank you for this, and look forward to working with you and partners on bringing that forward. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Caitlin Schmidt with the Center for Progressive Reform on improving environmental enforcement and transparency. It's all yours.
Great. Thank you, Pat. Hey, everyone. I'm Caitlin Schmidt with Center for Progressive Reform. Just want to give a shout out to the co-authors, Hannah Bruback from Chesapeake Legal Alliance and Morgan Johnson from Waterkeepers Chesapeake, who have both left their organizations, unfortunately, and Robin Broder has graciously stepped up from Waterkeepers Chesapeake to help me out on this front. But anyways, our paper was written on the premise that environmental laws are meaningless without adequate enforcement measures to back them up. The Chesapeake Bay restoration effort faces many obstacles, including shortfalls, lax enforcement of environmental laws and regulations, and subpar commitments to clean up the bay. On top of that, weak permits and enforcement contribute to millions of pounds of pollution to the watershed every year. During the last 4 years, federal non-compliance rates with some federal environmental laws reach as high as 70%, shifting a lot of the burden to environmental protection to the states. But right now, it's unclear whether Virginia has really risen to the plate on this front. So together, our recommendations, which are based partially off of Executive Order 6 from Governor Northam, look to address the status quo of enforcement approaches in Virginia and increase the public's understanding of pollution in their communities. So by providing DEQ adequate funding, authority, capacity to pursue these types of enforcement and compliance actions, especially for nearby environmental justice communities, Virginians will have a cleaner and healthier environment to which to live. So over the summer, since this paper was released, we met with the Department of Environmental Quality twice with their enforcement staff, and we were able to fine tune some of our recommendations. We learned that they had already made some progress on some of the recommendations within EO6, sort of broadening their authority to be able to issue on-the-spot fines and take action in terms of certain types of pollution sectors. But that said, there's still sort of some outstanding needs and that hit in line with our recommendations. And one of the key ones is being sort of transparency around their environmental enforcement and compliance efforts. So just as by way of an example, here in Maryland for the last 2+ decades, the Maryland Department of the Environment, the primary sort of enforcer of environmental laws here, has produced an annual enforcement and compliance report that analyzes all of the measures that the Maryland Department has taken over the last fiscal year to hold polluters accountable to certain water quality and other pollution standards. And more recently, we actually just got a win in requiring all of this information to be posted online on an ongoing basis. So here we get sort of more live, more live indicators of how the state is doing in terms of enforcing environmental laws and how many permittees are out of compliance. So MDE's report, and the reason I'm talking about it so much is that I'd love for Virginia to produce a similar report and sort of model it after MDE's with sort of a few tweaks because there's differences in how each of the enforcement programs works internally. But the 6 sort of key indicators that we'd love to see at least open up for sort of transparency, whether that be posting online or doing some sort of annual enforcement and compliance report that like MDE does, are one, the capacity for oversight and accountability. So MDE's report includes the number of environmental permits overseen by the department, the budget amounted for inspectors within the department, the number of inspectors budgeted for, and then the number of vacant positions. So all of these numbers really sort of give a sense of how many permittees the agency is responsible for, but also how many inspectors it has to really sort of adequately regulate those permittees. Another really key indicator that we'd love to see more transparency around in Virginia is the number of enforcement actions taken altogether. So this really can go to show you whether a department is, how aggressive or non-aggressive a department is in pursuing different environmental enforcement actions, especially given if we have knowledge around sort of compliance rates and non-compliance rates being high. Another key indicator that we'd love to see some more transparency around is the number of inspections. So this also really goes to show sort of how aggressive an agency is is being in terms of enforcement, because really it really boils down to sort of, enforcement on the agency front does have a lot to do with sort of the will of the agency to pursue the enforcement violations. Oftentimes we'll see violations occur, but no sort of response from the agency, and that's not what we'd like to see here, because we want to ensure greater compliance with environmental laws. And then the last three indicators, I'll just run through them quickly, are number of significant violations identified, number of compliance assistance rendered. And I know there's a little bit of compliance assistance doesn't really exist in Virginia, so we'll have to tweak that one a bit. And then the number of penalties collected. So all of these really sort of speak to how aggressive the Department of Environmental Quality is in terms of enforcement and compliance, but also can be used as a really awesome way to lobby for more funding for an agency. We've seen this in Maryland, where we'll notice in the annual enforcement and compliance reports, compliance really going down, enforcement really going down. And we point this out to legislators who say, okay, well, what's going on? Why aren't, do you not have MDE? Do you not have enough resources? Do you not have enough capacity funding? So it's really been a key tool to really sort of lobby for more funding for the agency, but also to build in more parameters around how the department is enforcing, also to build in sort of transparency around how the department is enforcing. And that's, I think, what really does not exist right now in Virginia, is that transparency component. So moving forward, we're gonna, really focus in on directing DEQ to either submit an annual enforcement and compliance report to the General Assembly that would have to be posted online, or, alternatively, perhaps some sort of online model of that, similar to what we have in Maryland. One that, and I think what will follow, which is our recommendation that, DEQ have restored funding to pre-recession levels. So I think that sort of follows the enforcement and compliance report, because that can be such a useful tool in advocating for greater funding for the agency. And then we're still working out on the recommendation to create a dedicated environmental justice enforcement and compliance division within the state's attorney general's office. But DEQ was certainly on board. So yeah, and with that, as I mentioned in the beginning of my statement, I just wanted to sort of point out that both of my co-authors have left. I sort of jumped on in more of a supportive role. So I'd love to lean on some outside VCN partners if possible, in terms of advocacy and legislative advocacy during the 2022 session. And you've got my contact info, so feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin. Building on the last issue that you brought up, environmental justice, perfect segue for Tanisha Griffin to join us from New Virginia Majority on something that has been all the talk and will continue to be so, hopefully for here on out, is prioritizing environmental justice in state government. It's all yours, Tanisha.
Hello, everybody. This is Tanisha Griffin, Environmental Policy Analyst with New Virginia Majority. Good to see you all this evening, well, this afternoon, my apologies. So I wanted to take the time to kind of actually provide a little, backstory and context to the legislative effort that's been going on coming out of the Virginia Environmental Justice Collaborative that formed around 2015. This will be the third time that we're trying to move forward EJ legislation starting out in 2019. So I wanted to kind of give some history to that to help people understand the connection between the policy recommendations that we find in the paper that was written with Peter Anderson, Appalachian Voices, Jay Ford from Chesapeake Bay Foundation. Thank you to them. They did a great job with the paper as well. So I wanted to do that. And I also want to talk about next steps. I know someone mentioned also political realities, and we're definitely trying to take those into consideration, but we're going to move forward, of course, anyway, because the urgency still remains. So to provide some backstory and context, as I mentioned, so in 2019, the Union Hill Buckingham case, Atlantic Coast Pipeline Dominion. I'm sure people are familiar with that issue. That was still rumbling. We're in a situation where we're about to have a trifecta. The EJ Collaborative took time to draft, come together, support, and introduce the Virginia Environmental Justice Act in the legislature. We were able to get that passed, and we're able to make it the policy of the Commonwealth that they need to promote environmental justice, get some environmental justice definitions codified, codify the Environmental Justice Council. I'm sure you all have seen a lot of the work that they have been doing to codify that and get that put into state law. So we're able to usher those things through. Obviously, not all the different pieces we wanted stuck into the bill. For instance, the Interagency Working Group on Environmental Justice actually became a budget item and didn't get codified. But that was a lot of progress we were able to make in 2020, and we're very proud of that. But like I said before, urgency still remained for doing some more comprehensive work on environmental justice in state law and policy. So in 2021, we came back to the legislature again. And this time we wanted to put in a permitting legislation around pre-application community engagement, around giving permitting boards the authority to actually deny or require mitigation plans for different activities that would have impacts, adverse, cumulative, disproportionate impacts on environmental justice communities. And we also want to try again on codifying the Interagency Working Group, because we want environmental justice to be a statewide initiative. We don't want it just to be something that one agency works on, because we know that a lot of the decision-making and investments and different policies and guidance and regulations that other agencies work on also have impact and historically have had adverse impacts on low-income communities and communities of color. And unfortunately, none of those vehicles were able to move forward and make it through passage. So a lot of the different policy recommendations that you see in the paper for this year reflect our desire to continue to move forward with those policy solutions. Just to, like I said before, I wanted to create some urgency around what's going on with that. So for instance, we have the Norfolk Naval Shipyard gas plant that was approved, the coal dust pollution issue in Norfolk that's still going on, methane capture facility as it relates to hog waste. I know that's something that's still in the rumblings. The MVP compressor station in Pennsylvania County, landfill expansion, gas plant developments and things like that in Charles City County. So there's still a lot of local conditions that are requiring us to maintain our steadfastness and move forward with these policy solutions in 2022. So just to give an update more so on, I guess, where we are given everything, but the political reality is that we're still definitely committed to moving forward. We have drafts in place for these different policy ideas, but we're definitely going to take time to see how we can work with the allies that we have had historically to make sure that these policies are still in the political arena, still in conversation, still showing up in the legislature, still showing up in the ears and, showing up as demands with state leadership. So we're still going to move forward in that way. That is the EJ Collaborative. And we're also going to take time to try to make sure we keep people involved in the process as well. So that's a little update on where we are with everything and a little bit of backstory to how we got to where we are on these different policy items. If people have specific questions on the paper itself, on trying to get involved in supporting the effort as we pivot and try to think more strategically about moving these policy solutions forward under these new political realities, I'm happy to help facilitate those conversations and also connect you all with the EJ Collaborative. But I want to thank Kyle again, and thank everybody for having me here, and hope that we can really keep moving this forward.
Thank you, Tanisha, for all your work on this and continuing work, as well as all your colleagues and co-authors. Last but not least, starting with our students, really, is Helen Kuhns from Lynn Haven River Now, is going to talk about our environmental future and creating environmentally literate students. It's all yours, Helen.
Thanks, Pat. Let me get my PowerPoint up real quickly here. Are you all seeing that?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, excellent, excellent. Okay, my name is Helen Kuhns, and I work with a local Virginia coastal region. I'm in Virginia Beach with Lynn Haven River Now. Also part of the board of directors for the Virginia Association for Environmental Education. Environmental education is a new topic for VCN, and we're really excited to be working on it for the second year this year. Our paper this time, excuse me, my co-authors were Daria Christian from Friends of the Rappahannock, and who was also on the Virginia Association for Environmental Education Board, and Christy Everett, the Hampton Roads director for the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. They both had a lot of great input, and I really love working with those two ladies. As this is sort of everybody knows this, we have environmental challenges across the Commonwealth, but we kind of have to remind ourselves of that as we look at why environmental education is so important and get to what our recommendations were for the legislature. If you think about Virginia, Virginia is a very varied state. We have lots of regions that have their own sets of environmental challenges. Many of these regions that have some of the severest environmental challenges are also those that have been historically underrepresented. And so we have to really make sure, if we are talking about education and environmental education, we're talking about the entire state. We want to make sure everyone, all of the students, get the same basic information and understanding of how these environmental factors work and how to make good decisions with them. You know, some of our man-made challenges our challenges are man-made. I think that's pretty obvious what those are, and a lot of them have been talked about in our common agenda. We're talking about things like mountaintop removal and uranium mining and fracking and air pollution, water pollution, invasive species even, and of course, climate change, which is providing the biggest set of challenges right now that we've ever had to deal with. And then there's some naturally occurring challenges as well. But a lot of those challenges are actually exacerbated by man's influence due to climate change. So, you know, climate change is really a big umbrella under which we really have to make sure that we are providing good and accurate education for folks. We want to make sure that environmental literacy is at the top. But unfortunately, we have a population in Virginia that has an unequal understanding of those challenges. What people understand very often now, the people who we are asking to make decisions may have gotten their science education 40 or 50 years ago, and they don't have enough understanding to necessarily know that what they're reading on the internet is not correct, or how some of those natural functions really are operating and how we can affect them positively or negatively. So we really need to look at these. We have to look at our population and really start to provide our people, starting with our preschoolers, our kindergartners, all the way up, so that we are making sure that people who graduate are graduating with a firm understanding of how our environment in Virginia works and how we can make adjustments and changes to make ourselves a more sustainable Commonwealth. So right now, I don't think it's any surprise to anybody, but education is not equal. That seems like a really, I don't know, strange thing to say, but whether it's monetary resources or how close children live to school, or what equipment the schools may have, our education systems across the Commonwealth of Virginia are not equal. I have two photos on this slide, and one of them is an elementary school, much like the one I went to when I was growing up in Virginia Beach. But however, that elementary school is in Petersburg, Virginia, and it may be as old as the ones I went to when I was in elementary school, which was a long time ago, I can promise you. And then look at the one at the top of the screen. And this school is actually probably 6 or 7 years old now. But this is an elementary and middle school in Virginia Beach, Virginia, where I am located. It's a wonderful school, and I'm so glad our students have it. But I wish all students had it. I wish that the resources were more equitable across the state so that our students could easily have access to that, whether they're in the southwestern corner of Virginia or in the mountains or out on the northern neck. I wish that all of our students were able to have that kind of resource, and they would be able to get the knowledge and the education that they really need. They wouldn't have a need for, they'd have the equipment they need, they'd have the opportunities that they need, they'd have lots of green space to work with and special gardens and things like that. But that is just not the truth of today. But we need to work towards that being the truth of tomorrow. So we really have to work on making sure that we are able to help bring the level of resources up in these disadvantaged communities so that everyone is able to get the same access to education. There are a lot of wonderful nonprofits around the Commonwealth that are able to help schools become more environmentally literate if they don't have the resources, and provide them with meaningful, I want to say, I call them me's instead of me-we's, because the me-we was traditionally centered around the Chesapeake Bay, but we have much more than just the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia to think about. So even though that's a big deal, we have a lot of the state which is in the Albemarle Pamlico, and we even have parts of the state that flow to the Mississippi. So we really have to think of it on a bigger picture. But these nonprofits, there's still access and funding barriers. The Office of Environmental Education was closed under DCR in 2016. That office provided statewide coverage for environmental education to our students. However, that was closed, and there is no centralized state agency that is providing environmental education across the entire Commonwealth. So because we're not there in our education system, excuse my dog, please. VDOE does not have a statewide environmental literacy plan. The governor did make STEM education a priority, and there are some opportunities available through that for environmental literacy, but it is not the same. And so we really need to look at that. So last year was the first year that environmental education, that we put a paper in our common agenda so that to try to help raise up environmental literacy in Virginia. And there's a lot of words on that slide, and you do not need to read them all. But from what we had recommended, which was $45 million in competitive grants, adding two new positions, one through education and one through natural resources, funding a state licensure endorsement for teachers under environmental education, and recruiting teachers who represented a more diverse community and would be able to help raise up the state environmental literacy. What we received was $270,000, which was a wonderful improvement. Right before that, we only had $80,000 going to environmental education across the entire state, but it was not open to competitive grants. It had a program that it funded solidly. So this was a great improvement. However, we moved to this year, and we have asked that the legislature fund $1.5 million in competitive grants to help raise up the literacy level in our schools. And it sounds like a really big number, but that number does not even provide a dollar's worth of environmental education to our public school students. It is less than $1 per student. So environmental education has a long way to go, and we really need to prioritize getting the environmental literacy into the underserved communities that are not getting the education that they need to be getting. And we need to be able to provide every student this level of education across the entire Commonwealth. It is just not happening right now. Going back to the schools, you can imagine that school in Virginia Beach has all the bells and whistles you could need. The one in Petersburg, maybe not. And they may not be able to afford field trips or be able to go anywhere. Aside from COVID and the restrictions that have been put in place through there, there's still so many barriers that keep some of these underserved areas from being able to get the opportunities that they need. One of the other things that we have recommended is that the Department of Education actually conduct a study to see if it would be possible to require public students to have a certain amount of environmental literacy when they graduate. This would ensure that all Virginia public school students are receiving the level of environmental education that they need to be informed residents of Virginia. And then finally, we're still asking, instead of asking for 2 positions like we did last year, we're asking that a full-time coordinator be put in place to oversee any of the literacy goals that we are working on. So there's a lot of room to grow when it comes to environmental literacy in Virginia, but we have to. I just feel like that there is no way that Virginia can get where it needs to be without putting some emphasis in funding and in working environmental literacy into our curriculums, into everything that we do. So I think really to reach that equitable environmental literacy level that we are looking for, we have to invest so that we can succeed and adapt. So thank you.
Thanks, Helen. Appreciate it. Everybody hold on for just a couple of more minutes. And if you have questions for any of our presenters, please put those in. I want to thank our presenters, co-authors today for joining us. And with that, we'll go right to Q&A. If you have any questions, put those in the Q&A button down at the bottom. Right now, it's pretty slim. Helen, I'm going to start with you. Chris Bast, hi, Chris, says that he'd love to understand more about what environmental literacy grants do or would do, and then what kind of programs, projects would school districts be looking to fund with those grant awards? You are muted.
Sorry about that. Chris, the opportunities are pretty much limitless, or it's limited as the funding. With the amount of money that was put in the budget for 2021, DCR was able to put $270 worth of grants out to organizations who were able to develop programs that would help underserved communities get some additional resources. Speaking for my organization, we were able to get a grant that would allow us to go into a traditionally underserved community, work with their schools work with their homeowners association, and work with the local businesses and faith communities to kind of pull together to have a community-wide educational impact, where the students were able to grow plants, they were able to learn about stormwater runoff, they were able to actually physically have an impact in areas that flood in their neighborhoods by putting plants in the right places and putting in the right plants, working strictly with native plants. So there, other schools they can on their school grounds even do like rain gardens, or they could have an outdoor classroom. There are so many different ways that kind of funding could be used. It's really each school and each region has their own needs. And I think that what they really lack is the funding to be able to make those types of things happen.
Thanks, Helen. In my prior life, I was an environmental educator, and typically you have certain standards you're trying to meet that every student is receiving, and then sort of evaluated on, okay, you were exposed to this, did you learn this, did you retain it, those sorts of things. So once you kind of achieve those, it can be a walk down the creek or in nearby, or it can be a trip out to somewhere like the Chesapeake Bay, where many students, that's just an abstract concept. All their water that they use goes to it every day. So there was only one other question thus far from Greta Lindemann, and I believe this is for you, Patrick. I think it's really the bulk of it is a comment about speaking to our citizen boards and what is a quote unquote agency stakeholder, and who determines that?
Yeah, thanks, Pat. Those are great questions. So as to the first point about, we submit our comments to the citizen boards, and then DEQ will summarize our comments and let the board know how they have addressed our concerns. And I agree that there is often a disconnect in the summaries, and really the only opportunity to correct that is during the very short window of 2 minutes that you get to talk to the board after you have submitted comments during a board meeting. So that's a real challenge and something that we need to correct so that there is more opportunity for the back and forth. We need to get that information from DEQ earlier so that we have an opportunity to ground truth whether they have interpreted our comments the way that we intended them, and if there's anything that we need to come prepared to rebut at the meeting. Seeing that information for the first time at the meeting is a challenge. As to your second question about who qualifies as a stakeholder, and I think that was in the context of the regulatory advisory panels that I mentioned and the technical advisory committees. And I mentioned the public participation guidelines. So all the citizen boards, as well as DEQ, have their own regulations that govern public participation. When they're considering a change to a regulation, they have the opportunity, but not the obligation, to convene a regulatory advisory panel to get input on the process of proposing those changes. And the regulations are, they give a lot of flexibility to DEQ and the boards to make the determinations, first of all, about whether to have that kind of input at all, or to have the agency just draft the regulations themselves. And secondly, a lot of discretion as to who will be considered a member of those groups. So CBF, other groups, we're always throwing our names in the hat to be considered for a regulatory advisory panel. But there's often a healthy amount of fear that it's up to the agency, it's up to the boards to determine whether they're going to choose you or not for that regulatory advisory panel. So I think that goes to the question of, is that the way to be the most inclusive when DEQ and the boards are considering regulatory changes?
Very true, Patrick. Gotta the squeaky wheel gets the oil sometimes on that, and I have screamed, "Oh, pick me, pick me, pick me, pick us," and to get partners onto some of these opportunities. And it's not necessarily equitable, and sometimes it is just get loud. So with that, let's see, we have one more. Greta, as a citizen commenter, I've never been invited to those 2-minute rebut opportunities. I don't think I would sit and wait for the invitation to come in the mail. You really have to be.
I'll just say you have the right, if you commented during the public comment period, you have the right to address the citizen boards at the meeting. And the time limit is usually arbitrarily set for 2 minutes for each one of those persons who submitted comments.
I've gone over my time. I want to thank all the authors. I'm going to throw it back to Kyle.
Hi, everybody. I want to say thank you once again to all of our authors, to all the VCN staff members, to all of our guest speakers in the past, and to all of our participants who came out to our Common Agenda educational events. I'd like to plug 2 events that we have coming up. If you came to any of these and you are interested in taking more action during the General Assembly, we'll be having a General Assembly 101 November 19th from 12 to 1:30 p.m. And this is just going to walk y'all through the General Assembly, its basics, and how to be a better advocate during the General Assembly. And finally, on December 3rd, we'll be having our annual 2022 General Assembly preview, where we will be giving y'all as environmental advocates a preview and a special look at what's to come up during the 2022 legislative session. So once again, we have a General Assembly 101 during November 19th and our General Assembly preview during December 3rd. And emails will be going or have gone out about that. So keep that on your radar. But once again, thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. That's my time. Thank you for coming out. And like I said, have a great rest of your day. Bye, everybody.